In this video, I'll explore one of the most crucial paradigms that I use in landscaping a life, in designing a future. And it begins with the environment. Every environment that we are in has a statistical probability field. Placing 100 bets in Vegas has a statistical probability field. Investing in the commodities markets has a statistical probability field. Investing in real estate in a given location, a statistical probability field. Taking arsenic, a statistical probability field. Ingesting fresh organic orange juice, a statistical probability field. And this probability field is the environment. Meaning, I live in Marin County, California. It has the highest rate of cancer per capita, I believe, anywhere in the country. And so if you move to Marin County, California, you participate in that statistic. If you move to Vegas and place 100 bets, you participate in that statistic. If you send your child to school, I think Sir Ken Robinson's research suggests that 98% of children enter school highly creative and productive and alive and engaged, and 2% leave the education system with some of that intact. And that's a probability field. You enter the prison system, again, another probability field. And so you have a given environment. And this environment enacts or interacts with an underlying set of drives called human needs. Abraham Maslow indicates they are a hierarchy of human needs, beginning with survival, moving to security of survival, to love and belonging, a yet deeper sense of survival in a socially constructed culture, moving to self-esteem, internalizing the blessing and sanction of the cult around us into the ability to appreciate ourselves, the development of our talents and gifts, and externalizing those gifts to create service and abundance in our community, and ultimately transcending the ego self, moving beyond the ego to community concerns, to things like legacy, to what is beyond the body, to spiritual pursuits as one of many expressions of transcendence, statues and things, another drive of transcendence. And so what we have is that in a given environment, some strategies for meeting these needs are rewarded more than others. So, for example, in a prison environment, allying oneself with the gangs or forming the toughest gang facilitates survival, security, love and belonging, etc. within the prison environment system. And if we create an environment intersecting with human needs that creates a clear pattern of pain versus well-being for one set of behavior versus another set of behavior. The other thing that we know is that on a statistical basis, the behavior that is rewarded, when we see people being the bigger bully, for example, meeting more of their need to survive, more of their need for security, more of their sense of love and belonging, self-esteem, etc., then the amount of weightlifting, etc., of those observing that will go up, statistically speaking, in an aspirational response to be the biggest bully in the prison system. And this is not control. there's not a robot physically moving your body around. And it's not to say that every human being, observing the fact that life expectancy goes up, that respect goes up, blah, 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 that every human being will do that behavior which is most rewarded in the given environment. Obviously, Nazi guards in the concentration camps were rewarded with survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem within their military framework, were rewarded for following orders, which included the barbaric behavior of other human beings, and were punished for violating orders. And yet some violated orders and died. Others violated orders and became low-ranking within a sociopathic cult. But that becomes a minority of people when the reward structure of a given environment creates significantly more well-being for those behaving one way than another. In Aboriginal terms, the death penalty was to disown the existence of a fellow tribesman, of a fellow Aborigine. So if all of one's family simply, and friends and community, simply stopped acknowledging you existed after a ritual that said you do not exist in our tribe anymore, we withdraw the love and belonging. The members of that community, banished, would simply curl up and die. Now, they didn't have to. They could have struck off on their own. They could have started whacking people in the tribe over the head and said, hey, wake up, I'm here. But they didn't. They respected the community structure and would ultimately curl up and just die of starvation and dehydration. They didn't want to live if there was no love and belonging for them in their community. So, statistically speaking, the thoughts, feelings, and actions of an individual will migrate into an identity that is rewarded with well-being for the behaviors that allow them to meet their human needs within a given environment. In a prison, that may mean aligning with the biggest and baddest gang. In a monastery, that may mean chanting with a great pitch. In an education system, that may mean mimicking and copying a teacher, if it's a mimicking education system. And in a swim team, that may mean ignoring every other interest in life and obsessing about swimming and getting the gold medal. The environment, as it intersects with the hierarchy of needs, has a statistical significance over the thoughts, feelings, and actions of a given individual. So we have things like the tension between willpower or free will and environment. And one of the interesting things, if you're working with groups, for example, if the police want to shift an entire group of criminals into turning over one of their own, in the general scale of things, us versus them, that's not going to happen. But a $10 million prize for information might tip the scales. A $100 million prize would have a statistical majority of criminals actively trying to get the 100 million over protecting one of their own. So the environment shifts, and a statistical majority moves with the change of the environment. And this is what's very significant, because in a chauvinistic cult or culture, the emphasis is on the individual, not the environment. The environment is the feminine, it is the circle, it is the influence. The individual is the focus within a chauvinistic system. And so one is taken to task as an individual for their personal actions. You didn't have to follow orders. You could have disobeyed your family. You didn't have to do what your husband told you to. You were at choice. You, the individual, is what matters. And the environment is not our concern. In a chauvinistic culture, the focus would be on an individual. In the chauvinism of assessing the Vegas phenomena, for example, if 100 people go to Vegas and each place 100 bets, 98% of people leaving Vegas will have less money in their pocket and will most likely be cleaned out of all the money they arrived with. So that's 98% of people placing 100 bets will lose within the Vegas environment. But in a chauvinistic cult, where the focus is on the individual, the focus is not on that 98% or on the statistical probability of loss. It's all on the winner. How did you win? What did you do? As if somehow they have something involved. And certainly if they can count cards or something, they may have a part there. But in the general statistics, they're just part of a very small statistic of a back eddy in an enormous statistical environment that eats up money, and that's its whole purpose. So the identity of an individual is significantly formed by the environment on a statistical level. And there's an interesting thing with willpower, which is that, for example, you can find yourself in a drunken sex orgy where drugs are being passed around, this and that and the other, and you can use willpower to get yourself out of that environment. If you stay in that environment of drunken sexual orgy with drugs being passed around and encouraged, etc., for 10 days, the statistical odds that you will partake are more than 99%. Again, you put 100 men in a drunken sexual orgy where drugs and alcohol are encouraged, every 10 minutes for 10 days. And the willpower gets tired. And so in a tension between environment over time, the purpose of willpower is not to stay in a highly addictive, suggestive environment and just endlessly fight that environment. The purpose of willpower is to get out of that environment into a probability field that is completely different. Because you take those same 100 people and you put them at a monastery where there's no drug, there's no alcohol, there's no sex, there's no video games and no cell phone destruction, and suddenly they're contemplating interesting theories about life and meaning and maybe people they should repair relationships with, because it's an environment that rewards that. It is an architecture of beauty. You see other meditative people who have dedicated to that, and it completely shifts one's state. Now, the other dynamic you have, of course, is control and influence. And this is somewhat of a gray scale, because you have one school that says, I'm free, I'm always in control. Well, what does that mean exactly? Could 10 people with machine guns get your body to do anything they want your body to do? Yes or no? If not 10, 20 people, 30 people? How many people does it take with an intense focus on pulling all the limbs of your body apart before you don't really care about the philosophical meaning of the word personal control. Because for all effective purposes, whatever you want your body to do, namely get out of there, isn't happening. If you're in jail in the United States, where millions of Americans are, then the idea of wanting to be out of prison today, it doesn't really matter that much, because there is a level of mass and force at which you as an individual don't have control. There are other areas where you do have control, when you're out of prison, when you can decide to drive home this way or that way. But what if you want to drive home in a way where there's no road? Is the road pattern that's laid out simply an influence, or is it determining? Is it controlling your behavior? And at what level? And similarly, well, no one can control my mind. Well, at certain levels of alcohol or at certain levels of injected drugs of various kind, coupled with sleep deprivation and all of the various dissociative techniques perfected by Mengele and the US CIA in part of torture and interrogation techniques, at what point is it, does a kilogram of LSD still leave you clearly deciding one's own thoughts? And if not, who is? And so what's the point where one is not in control of one's actions, one's body, one's thoughts, and one's feelings? Most of us, of course, don't have to consider that. But it is important to understand that in the continuum of environments that form our identities, that at certain densities, preference becomes domination, influence becomes control, probability becomes certainty. You take 300 machine gun bullets through the head, the probability of you surviving that attack is zero in terms of anyone who's ever had 300 machine gun bullets through the head. One machine gun bullet, people have survived that. Not many, but a few. And so we have the individual in relationship to group statistics. And the purpose of this video is in part to emphasize the significance of one's personal choices around one's environment. And let me give you an example. I was being rejected online by 98% to 99% of Bay Area women. And in that environment, I felt tired, depressed, irritable, critical, lonely, because, having insecure attachment disorder to begin with, and then having that just rubbed in my nose at a 99 to 1% kind of dynamic, it just felt miserable. And I could, of course, focus on a positive mental attitude, a book I read in my childhood by W. Clement Stone and Napoleon Hill, Success with a Positive Mental Attitude. And I was indeed positive enough to write hundreds of emails. But once you've got more than 100, you understand the statistical probability that you're dealing with. And I understood that for what I was looking for, I would be rejected 99% of the time, and I understood that that would be more painful for me than to not do it at all. And I understood that if I didn't do it at all, that there was not a single woman in the history of women in my whole life experience who had ever approached me for what I was interested in, which is a damning statistical scenario. What it's basically saying is there's no hope of anyone approaching me by the fact that it's been 40 years and nobody has. So I've encountered, 10,000 people, so that's a less than 1 in 10,000% statistic. And there's a 99% chance of this happening and a 100% chance of me feeling tired and miserable about that. That's the San Francisco Bay Area in relationship to me and some very specific things that I'm looking for in a relationship. Okay, that's not going to change. What is going to change is, for example, the question, is there some place on the planet where these statistics shift? Is there some place on the planet where by locating myself there, this statistic turns on its head? And it turns out that there is. The Philippines is about 5,000% more receptivity. 5,000%. So that's an incredibly different environment. Denmark, another region where 300% more receptivity. Italy, 200% more receptivity. Thailand, let's say 700% receptivity. More than the San Francisco Bay Area. And then there's 1,000% more spontaneous quality time of an enjoyable nature with men and women in Thailand, in all kinds of things, paragliding, conversations, this, that, a completely different environment. So the point is that one's thoughts, feelings, and actions do ultimately get shaped by one's environment. And if one wants to create, this is called an identity. An identity is a habit of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When you say, who is that person? Well, they think these thoughts, their face looks like this, they move their face like that, they move their body like this, they say these things, they feel these things. That's who that person is. That person is a habit of their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors. But is it really that person? Or is it that environment produces a statistical sampling, and among that statistical environment, that environment demands that a certain number of people will think like this and feel like this and act like this. And as this human being interacted with that environment, they had the 5 different roles that they could play, and they were, as a sensitive, more predisposed to this role, or as a trauma survivor, they were more predisposed to this role. And so the influences in the past intersecting with the environment in the present meant that there's a 98% chance that they're going to form one of these identities. Maybe there's 5 key identities, and there's common traits that this environment is so harsh on anyone who exhibits this trait that none of those 5 people, statistically speaking, will exhibit that trait. Now, this could be a very positive trait, like trusting people. You could have people that in another environment would trust people, and so they'd leave their cars open, like they do in Abu Dhabi. Because in Abu Dhabi, you can leave the keys in a Lamborghini, or is it Emirates? Anyway, you can leave keys in a Lamborghini and no one's going to touch it, because the security cameras that are on every street corner and the penalties for crime are an environment in which no one in their right mind tries to steal a car. They're always caught, and the penalties are severe, and it's a wealthy culture. And so, it's just not incentivizing theft. So there isn't any. So people leave the keys in Lamborghinis. Now you take that same person who leaves their key in their Lamborghini and you bring them into to Oakland, California, and that behavior of trust and openness is severely penalized to the tune of $300,000 a day as your Lamborghini disappears and does not get recovered by a police force that's not terribly motivated and relatively inept without as much competency and tools. The police in Oakland don't have BMWs or race cars or Porsches the way they do in Abu Dhabi, and so the thieves get away. Every day you trust people, you lose $300,000. You feel the pain of that, and so you very quickly learn to stop trusting. And so an identity is the repeated habit of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that is rewarded in the environment. Now, there's an interesting thing around this in what is our environment. And I would suggest that one of the things that's our environment is our culture. One of the things is our media consumption. One of the things is what we consume in our physical bodies. One of the things is the habits of people around us. One of the things is the natural environment. For example, cold climates that get below freezing demand more long-term thinking than temperate environments in which there's an abundance of food. Because in a cold environment where you suddenly have, killer cold, if you don't think about the future, you're just caught there unawares and you die. And so cold climates encourage long-term thinking. Now, there is, of course, a tension between who we long to be as human beings and the people that our environment will reward us for being. So, for example, I might long to be friendly and generous, but in a prison environment, if I get fucked up the ass, as the word gets around that I'm a soft guy, I have to make a choice, which is, do I want to be the person I want to be, which is warm and generous, and regularly fucked up the ass and humiliated, or do I want to be the person that doesn't get fucked up the ass, who I don't want to be, but am willing to be so that I don't get fucked up the ass? And the exact same thing is true in relationships. So, for example, if I am with a very irresponsible woman who regularly forgets everything, then my choice is to either arrive regularly at our destination and find, oh my gosh, I didn't bring any money. Oh my gosh, I forgot to fill up the gas in the car. We'll just have to walk 5 miles to a gasoline station. Oh my goodness, I forgot to turn off the stove at the house. We'll just have a blown up house. So I can either deal with the consequences of the forgetfulness, or I can become a nag, or I can leave the relationship. I can leave the relationship and say, you know what? I don't want to be your nag, and I don't want a blown up house, and I don't want to walk 5 miles for gas. And so I'm leaving. I'm going to create another environment in which the next person has a good memory and thinks ahead and about the future. And so that's where the willpower is. Because if you are, anxious about something, for example, if someone's a terrible driver and they're driving, you are going to become a backseat driver. It's going to be tense and it's going to build up. It's like, move that, do this. So if you don't want to be a backseat driver and you actually do care about your body, you've got to move into another location. Now, I experienced this level of environmental shift quite dramatically in the polyamorous framework, in which I had 7 lovers for a period. And And of course, each of the lovers was different. And so one lover rewarded me with cards and gifts and very carefully thought out things for this kind of behavior. Another rewarded me for my cooking. She oohed and awed over my cooking. And so I became a great chef for her and with her. But when I was with the others, who could care less about my cooking, I was not a great chef. Because I'm looking for survival and security, for love and belonging and self-esteem. And the woman who's oohing and aahing about every dish I make is inspiring me to cook new dishes I've never cooked before. Of course, I want those needs. I want to be welcomed. I want to be praised. I want to matter. I want to watch her body in pleasure and feel that I'm important. I want those things. These are human needs that every human in human history has needed, not just preferred. So I prefer to survive today. If I get run over by a truck, who cares? In fact, why even get out of bed? I'll just rot here. Every human being has needed these things, and so I get a huge influx when I cook gourmet food with this woman. But the woman I see on Thursday, not the slightest interest. I could go to town. I could work for 3 hours and prepare the finest meal imaginable, and she's like, yeah, whatever. So, of course, there's pain in making the effort and feeling that it doesn't matter. So, of course, I don't make any effort on food, and so I'm not a great chef with her. And what was interesting is because each of these 7 people rewarded very different parts of me for very different reasons in different ways. I had different identities, different patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving with each of these people. I'm very, very funny, according to this woman, and so I make lots of jokes. I'm a great chef with this woman, so I cook gourmet food. I'm very casual and kind of outgoing, and that's praised by one woman, so we play tennis and we do this and we do that. Now, I enjoyed all of these different parts of me. They were each different identities. But the other, what I found interesting was that the women would not have recognized me. And the other thing that I found interesting was that they were not aware of their influence. And it took having 7 people, each rewarding very different things, for me to understand the profound impact of influence. Because I wanted all of them to be happy. I felt happy when they were happy, so I wanted myself to be happy. And none of these things were outside of my principles. I never lied to any one of them. I never cheated with any one of them. I never hurt or shouted at anyone. So we're not talking, split personality. But I enjoy tennis, and if you're all into that, let's play tennis. I enjoy making jokes, and so if you're laughing uproariously at every one of my jokes, I will make tons of jokes. It's fun. It's entertaining for me to watch you laugh. And if you love my cooking, fine, let's cook. And then there was the tantric lover. She went into ecstatic orgasms in all of our sex. And so this became a mystical journey that was very deep. There was a lot of tears and joy and laughter, and there was this transcendent space. And so I prepared and treated her body completely different, because the other woman didn't respond to anything but intense stimulation. So the focus was completely different. It wasn't playing a violin, it was banging a drum. And because that's what she responded to. And so there's this very interesting tension between the environment and the individual. And does one pick the environment that supports who one wants to be, or is one unconsciously, by default, what survives in a given environment? And I think you have to move around a lot within an environment in order to notice which one is it. Is it really that I don't like being this at all? I've just never experienced anything else, and this gets rewarded. The beauty of travel, the beauty of reading, the beauty of having numbers of partners over time, so that I get to say, you know, Claire always reads my books. She reads everything I write, and she comments on it, and she salivates over it, and she enjoys it, and she has things to say. And I like the person in me who writes them, and I like the person in me who produces this effect in a person, and I like listening to her thoughts about it, and so I write more. And so I am a book writer with Claire. And I'm a playful fool with Genebibes, because she's always playing and has a very young energy, etc. And so with her, she likes this, and she hates books and stuff. So I'm not really a writer with her. So who do I want to be? Do I want to be the writer or the playful, warm teddy bear? Does it have to be both? Yeah. Does it have to be one or the other? Kind of. If particularly if one of them is highly possessive and doesn't want a shared relationship, kind of. Which one is it? So do we pick the people that draw out in us the parts that we like and enjoy, or are we just unconsciously the people we are because of the environment we find ourselves in? And I think it starts like the latter. Now, there's also this interesting thing with identities, is that we can give birth to an identity in imagination. We can imagine ourselves in a tropical island on a long vacation with a very particular someone that we've never met. We can imagine ourselves with someone, and we can imagine an identity. We can imagine who we want to be. I want to think like this. I want to feel like that. I want to do these things. And in this imagination, that's what I'm doing. Because in that imagination, I'm being rewarded. I'm being given a reward for being that way. And another thing that shifts things is substances, be it opium, cocaine, psychedelics, etc. They change the state, and we become, in that altered environment, a different identity. We have a different pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving when we've microdosed LSD than when we haven't. When we've taken 5 grams of psilocybin than when we have not. And there is an identity of flowering that can occur in a new romance, on a vacation, on a psychedelic journey, with a high adrenaline ride from running. There is an identity that gets born, a pattern of thinking, feeling, and doing in that environment. And the question is, what happens with the blossoming of that flower of a new identity when it returns to the coldness of the environment that shaped the old identity? What happens to the budding holiday romance when you go back to work, for example? Well, this relationship and the identity that supported the relationship in both people blossomed in the context of the holiday romance. It is now withering and starving for water now that we're both back at work, or now that you're back at work and I'm still in vacation mode. Where are you? Where's the attention? Where's the laughter? Now you're just tired and busy. Oh, you're not playing with me anymore. There's no one hitting the ball back. And so this part in me that came to life to be with you is dying. And that's the thing. Identities are born and die all the time. And of course, the grief when somebody dies is that there is an identity, a habit of thinking, feeling, and behaving that we develop biologically with a person that we're close with a significant other. Now, when they die, they're not hitting the ball back in the way that supports the existence of that identity. That identity cannot survive in an isolated environment, in a vacuum, without their presence to reinforce it. They are not there. And so a part of us that we love dies. And that is the grief. That is the betrayal. That is the rage, the trauma. That is the self-absorption. They're off on another level, enjoying the multiverse. We have lost a significant identity that we don't have the power to recreate, because you can't recreate an identity that took 30 years to build, because there may be different levels of that identity that it takes 5 years before you open up about this, and then another 2 years before you open up that, and then you have to have 3 experiences where they passed this test, and then you open up about that, and you don't even understand your own architecture, and so the new person doesn't meet any of those criteria, so that identity doesn't come forth, and it withers. And we watch it die inside our body, inside our heart, inside our mind, and we ache for it, and it withers. Because we cannot keep that identity alive without the environment there to support it for very long. Now, we can tug on it. We can look at videos and photos and nostalgia, etc. But there is, of course, an element of pain because it's a narrow dimension and it's repetitive. And with hedonic adaptation, if our partner isn't doing something new, then, it starts to tune out and there is a withering. Now, what's interesting is that identities, our probable identities, exist above us, below us, to the left and to the right of us. Meaning, there is an identity that drinks. I don't drink, but there is a me that does drink. There's an identity of who I would become if I did drinking. I don't go to sex parties, but there is a me that does. Meaning there is an identity. If I attended one sex party a day, there would be a pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving that would emerge in that environment that is different than the me that stays home and makes these videos. There is a probability field of identities, and the one that crystallizes from possibility to probability to actuality is the one that is sustainable in the environment in which I find myself within the underlying architecture of human needs. And there is a certain amount of fear, pain, and survival threat that will reactively catapult me out of a preferred identity into an identity that can survive a painful and sociopathic environment. So, I may be fine letting someone steal the Lamborghini for $300,000. I may be fine someone steals my clothes. But if I'm beaten over the head with a baseball bat repeatedly for smiling, maybe I'm in a homophobic culture where I've happened to have smiled at a man. If I'm beaten over the head with the baseball bat and then shouted at and then kicked and all this, then the fear, pain, and survival that is attacking my friendly identity will pivot reactively in this hierarchy of human needs of survival into something that is more sociopathic and that is not so painfully punished in the environment around me. And in that sense, we are all prisoners of the sustainability field of the environment in which we find ourselves. The time and place and culture in which we are born has a statistical probability field. 1 in 7 Americans will be a substance addict at this period in time. Well, take your pick. Are you one of those 7, or did you dodge that one? 20% of Americans will be depressed. Okay, that's 1 in 5. Okay, so 1 in 7, 1 in 5. How many of these can you dodge before you're a part of that probability field? Or perhaps you get depressed because it's depressing to see 20% of the people around you highly depressed. Viruses, are contagious. Now there's one, there's one transcendent piece, because no system is entirely closed. And there's one transcendent piece around this, which is the inner world. Every night when we dream, every time we go inward, we create, to a certain extent, an inner environment. Maybe we're a slave, being beaten and kicked 6 hours a day in our outer environment, and that has enormous implications in our habits for thoughts, feelings, and actions, tending to try a lot of behaviors and find what minimizes the kicking and the unnecessary humiliation and all that. But in the inner environment, we may be a hero, we may be a superhero, etc. And what we think and feel, and some of what we plan and prepare ourselves for, might be a time of breaking free of slavery, or simply putting a part of our entity, a part of our consciousness, into the inner world, superimposed in a way that strengthens an identity. That strengthens an identity not from what's going on in the outer environment. What's going in the outer environment is killing hope, for example. Killing hope. For example, in the United States, there are numerous statistical probability fields that are creating helplessness and hopelessness for a noticeable percentage of people. Helplessness, hopelessness, uncertainty, panic, fear. The environment is creating that statistical probability field. But in the inner world of prayer, meditation, transcendence, whatever it is, I'm creating an environment that is hopeful, full of hope. Because in my inner environment, this happens, and in my inner environment, that happens. And my inner environment, you have things like Viktor Frankl saying you can endure any what if you have a why, if you have a purpose, if you have a meaning. Man's search for meaning, a man who survived the concentration camps of Germany with a meaning, with a why, with a vision, with a belief, etc. And that's part of our environment. And so this is the loop. This is the bit that, if you're not being bludgeoned daily and doused with a kilogram of LSD and strobe lighted into dissociation, and you have a peaceful prison cell or whatever it is, you can be the Mandela. Now, statistically speaking, the odds are against you. How many Nelson Mandelas are there? How many angry people who commit suicide in prison are there? And so it's nothing to say, let's send everyone to prison and we'll get more Nelson Mandelas. Why should we murder 98% of the population just because 2% come out of there better? But in an identity probability field, one of the biggest challenges in life is to periodically navigate and look at what is the probability field, what is the range of probability fields with a given situation. If I was to spend 2 weeks in Costa Rica, who would I become? And do I like that me more than I like this me? The trick is to create it sustainably. So that how can I use my willpower, my control, and my individuality to either permanently get me into an environment that supports who I want to be, or that changes my environment to provide me with significantly more well-being in the form of my human needs than pain. Now, we have the common deterioration of well-being in trauma, meaning trauma engages the reptilian brain and deteriorates the individual down into PTSD, which is a living hell, as a fight, flight, freeze brain and mentality within a sociopathic environment that lacks the decency to develop a culture that knows how to prevent and then heal PTSD and trauma when it occurs. We also have the human spirit and the human idealism, in which every single human being instinctively gravitates towards well-being. And as in that semi-conscious groping towards well-being, as we stumble across the Platonic values of beauty, truth, and goodness, every individual experiences more well-being in the presence of beauty than ugliness, experiences more well-being in the presence of goodness than in slimy disgust, experiences more beauty and pleasure in truth, in the understanding that is only possible with truth. If you say 4 plus 4 equals 3,899, you get confused. Wait a minute, here's 4 blocks, and here's 4 blocks. We put them together, and you say that's 3,890. No, it looks like 8 blocks. No, it's not. But if you say 4 plus 4 is 8, and you count them up, and there's 8, there's a sense of delight, of beauty. It's like it matches. I understand. So every human being is moving towards beauty, truth, and goodness. And the desire to create an identity that embodies the ideal of beauty, truth, and goodness integrates the truth of environmental statistical influence to create an environment that supports and rewards more than punishes and discourages beauty, truth, and goodness. So that 98% of people using their free will and power and control will reinforce the environment of beauty, truth, and goodness. And maybe a few, people are rebelling and stuff and need to create some evil or some pain and suffering or to wake up or something like that. But that the vast majority of people, imagine if we wanted everyone to leave Vegas as a winner, well, you just change the house odds to the opposite of what they are now. Right now, 60% of the time the house wins. 70% of the time in this casino or that casino, the house wins. And so if the average person places 100 bets, 98, 99% of people will leave with little or no money. Okay, we'll flip it around. If you set the variables that 70% of the time the customer wins, and the casino loses, then everyone who places 100 bets has a 98, 99% chance of leaving that environment with more money. You don't chide the people for losing money when the odds are 70% against them. You might question, well, why did you go there if you knew those were the odds? And use your willpower to go somewhere else. Go to a real estate investing course or plant a garden where 80, 90% of seeds grow if you plant them in fertile soil. And so engineering an identity is ultimately about engineering an environment. Engineering an environment is ultimately about engineering an identity, because it takes a certain identity to create the environment that can give birth to another identity. And that's the dance. That's the dance. To continually use our willpower, our control, our individuality to become patterns of thinking, feeling, and doing that create an environment in which there's more support for being thinking, feeling, and doing environment that is more beautiful, more true, more good, because it's more fun, because there's more well-being.